We are going to chat today about mobile release management, a bit about why it's needed and the cost of not choosing to prioritize it. Quick agenda. We'll quickly introduce ourselves. I think we know some of you, a bunch of you we don't know, so I'll tell you a bit about us and our background. We're going to start with some of the background on why mobile is difficult and unique. We'll move on to sort of the impact that has, why it matters if your release process isn't so smooth or so great. And then we'll talk about sort of what you can do when it comes to release management, some of the things to focus on or think about when you want to improve your process. So let's get started. On that first point, I'm Gabriel. I'm one of the founders of Runway. I know some of you might not recognize me with this mustache. No one knows why it's there, but that's how that goes. Former iOS engineer. I've worked just about my whole career until Runway in mobile and in iOS at teams of some scale and also on my own apps. So I've seen kind of the spectrum of how shipping for mobile can go. And yeah, excited to be here with you all.
Cool. So I'll jump in. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. My name is Isabel. I'm also a co-founder of Runway. And like Gabe, I have a career in mobile development as well. I was an iOS engineer for almost 10 years. Also dabbled in React Native, wrote some apps in React Native over at with the team at ClassPass, so have some experience with cross-platform as well. And Gabe and I actually met working together on the mobile team at Rent the Runway here in New York. And so we definitely experienced our fair share of challenges with the mobile release process, and especially kind of in the context of teams that are maturing and kind of looking to mature the release process and grow and scale the company and the team alongside it. And yeah, excited to be here. So I'm going to kick us off here. And we're going to jump right into talking about why mobile releases are special. Why are they uniquely difficult? And the first thing that we like to kind of touch on when we talk about some of the challenges that come with mobile releases are the fundamental differences that exist between the mobile platform compared to other sort of software that's released, like web and server and backend types of deploys. And I don't know about you guys that are on the call here, but I personally, when I was an iOS engineer, and we still see this a lot, get questions from my friends in front end or back end or platform, and they're always like, what's going on over on mobile? Like, why is it so hard to release over there? Why do things take so long? Why are things, not just like you cut a tag off main and then you build that and then you deploy it and you do that multiple times a day, no big deal, non-event. And if something goes wrong, you just roll it back, right? And so I've answered that question a lot with, folks that aren't that familiar with the way that binary releases work. And, if you, as you guys, I'm sure, have built and released mobile apps, it's sort of kind of like easy to laugh at that and be like, well, actually, it's pretty different over on the mobile side of things, So we're packaging these binaries up and we're putting them on an app store, and then users choose to install our apps on their devices. And once they've installed an app on their device, there's no guarantee that they're ever going to update that app again. And so, you can end up with a very long tail of versions out in the wild on different devices, on different OSs. And on top of that, we have to deal with, the fact that there's this middleman, this third party that is actually in charge of delivering the software to our users. And of course, I'm talking about Apple and Google. And unfortunately, we kind of have to abide by some of the, rules that they put into place that make it possible for us to put updates out there for our users. And so, we have to prepare this binary. It has to often get packaged together with some additional metadata, things like release notes, screenshots, app details, product pages, all that kind of thing. And then we have to send it out for review and then hope for the best. And, in best case of scenarios, your update is approved in a couple hours, and then your users are free to download that whenever they choose. Worst case scenario could take a couple days. And so kind of out of the gate, that just, kind of raises the bar on quality for mobile quite a bit, because there's this inability to roll back kind of out of the gate. And then there's also just this additional overhead that goes into releasing any kind of update. And so even a small mistake can be way more costly on mobile than it would be on web and backend. And Gabe's going to talk about that a lot more after this. So yeah, fundamental platform differences. And then if we zoom in a little bit on what the release process like actually looks like day to day, if you're somebody that's looking to get an app update out the door, there's a lot of moving pieces and a lot of tools that you have to be familiar with and that you have to be, pretty kind of agile moving across and understanding in order to just do something simple like a release out. And so let's break down what, some examples of that are. So on the code side of things, if you're an engineer, we're talking, of course, about version control, GitHub, your Bitbucket. This is where you're looking at your code, you're committing your code in, you're maybe cutting release branches, maybe cherry picking in some fixes for a release, making sure your PRs are all in there, everything's approved and merged. So obviously you're going to be pretty familiar with that. Then there's the project management side of things. So this tends to be more of the domain of like a product side of the org, but engineers are definitely, part of that as well. And so there's the responsibility of kind of going in there, making sure that your features are getting moved across in terms of status when they get released, that they're getting their correct fix version attached so that product managers can have an accurate understanding of what's going out with a given release. So that's the project management side of things. So your Jira's, your Asana, your Linear. I'm not sure what you guys are out there using. You should post it in the comments. Let us know. It's always interesting to hear what folks are using. And then we move into the CI/CD tooling. So most teams have some kind of basic build system in place. So this is the tools like your Circle CI, your GitHub Actions, your Bitrise you're using to compile your build and upload it for distribution, whether that be beta distribution or like actual App Store distribution. And so in the best cases for CI/CD, you're kind of going in there and maybe you're clicking a button to start the build, and then you can kind of come back and check on it every once in a while. Worst case scenario, something breaks in your build and you're going in there and you're having to like dig through a bunch of garbled logs, and it's no fun. And especially if you're not familiar with those tools, it can be extremely intimidating to come in there and be like, oh, like the build just failed. Now what am I supposed to do? And how do I figure out what went wrong? So that's build system. And then, of course, we have our app stores, App Store Connect, infamously clunky and frustrating and, hair-pulling kind of experience with App Store Connect's gotten better in, recent years. But yeah, it still has its quirks. On the Play Console side of things, definitely some nuance to know there as well. And again, for folks that are maybe not as familiar with these tools, like every time that you're coming in to do a release, having to sort of reacquaint yourself with how things work, with everything that you have to do, and with changes in the platform itself. Like there's often things that are popping into your face, like new alerts that you weren't aware of. It just adds all of this kind of overhead that you have to be familiar with and you have to be equipped to handle. And let's not forget stability monitoring. And so our tools like Instabug, Sentry, Crashlytics, Firebase Crashlytics, super important for monitoring the health of your release as it goes out. Also during, the beta stages or sort of testing stages of the process. But yeah, for that, you kind of have to know what to look for as well. And so it sort of requires that there's some pre-existing established kind of framework for understanding the health of a release when you're trying to study it. So I just covered, I think, 5 different tools that are pretty kind of critical for any release process that you're running. And this is just like a taste. This is like a toe in the water. There's actually so many more tools that, depending on what your team is doing, kind of come into play. So things I'm just going to throw out there, like translation tools, if your team is doing localizable strings and like translating your app to different languages, you're going to have to go in there and be familiar with that, with exports and whatnot. Things like regression testing tools like TestRail and X-Ray. So if you're using that, that comes into play as well. Product analytics, things like Amplitude, Datadog, New Relic, trying to understand the behavior of your users for your release when it goes out. Things like PagerDuty and OpsGenie for kind of managing the rotation if you have that in place. So yeah, it's just like the basic frameworks are kind of a lot, and you could end up with this, the thing that we like to talk about is the like problem of a million tabs open, where you're trying to run a release and you have like 10 different tabs and you need to kind of go into each one and know what to do in different cases and like what to look for. And it can become pretty harrowing pretty quickly. And yeah, lots of moving pieces. And the last kind of piece I want to talk about here is how releasing for mobile is really an org-wide effort. It's a very collaborative and cross-functional effort. And so, we touched on how, product has a stake in what's going out in a given release. So that's absolutely true. Engineering, of course, does as well. Product cares about what's going out, what bug fixes are going out with the release, what new features are getting turned on for this release. We also have stakeholders in QA, of course, so they are trying to keep on top of what needs to be tested, what's failed, communicating that to the right people. We have folks sometimes, also in marketing. So like I mentioned, some of those additional kind of metadata, screenshots, release notes, that kind of thing that needs to get pulled together is usually kind of falls on the marketing team. It could also be something like they need to be aware of a new feature going out because they're getting ready to push out an email campaign or something like that. And so there's that element of it as well. With some teams, we even see kind of leadership stakeholders even. So, this need for legal approval or leadership approval, depending on, the type of app that you're releasing in industries that are highly regulated, we do see the need for this as well. And so with all of those stakeholders, communication becomes kind of a big problem because you need to keep all those stakeholders, all those folks kind of aware of the status of things and also aware of what they need to do. And if they're blocking the release process, that communication can quickly become pretty chaotic, and you can end up with a situation where you're getting asked, if you're running a release, you're getting asked a lot of the same questions by a bunch of different people all the time, and that can kind of be pretty chaotic and stressful. And I think we actually have a great quote here that we pulled from a software engineer over at PrizePicks that sort of speaks to this. I'm just going to read it out. All these people from different teams, engineers and PMs, would come in and say, did my code make it in? Did this feature get updated? I spent a lot of time backtracking and digging through Slack to get this information, and there was no organization around it. It was kind of like the Wild Wild West. So yeah, that absolutely speaks to this feeling of kind of chaos and just a lot of things moving at the same time and a lot of kind of communication difficulties. And this is all contributing to kind of this answer or this question of like, why is mobile so hard and why does it feel so hard? Anything you want to add there, Gabe?
Yeah, no, you covered a lot of ground. I think the one thing that's interesting that is sort of relevant as you think about going from the status quo, trying to make change within a wider org, is that, yes, like probably everyone on this call is quite familiar with mobile and a lot of the uniqueness and complexity. Chances are other folks in your org, non-mobile, are less familiar. And so there's this common scenario where mobile kind of sits in its own corner. Mobile has to advocate for itself. And you need to kind of be diplomatic and good at, I guess, helping folks understand some of these specific challenges and the uniqueness of mobile. Increasingly important because your org, your wider company, in most cases, is caring more and more about mobile as a channel. But they need to understand that it's different and therefore needs different kinds of resources, more support when it comes to tooling, for example, that sort of thing. Cool. So going from there, sort of why is mobile different, complicated, to the sort of outcomes there, the end result of that, like why does that matter? How is that going to manifest on your team, and why is it something to pay attention to? You have a lot of competing priorities, and what we found is often releases actually fall down the pecking order, and there's a few reasons for that. I think one of the biggest is it's hard to see if you just like freeze a moment in time and inspect your team's process. It's hard to see the real impact of bad release process. And on the flip side, the ROI, if you were to prioritize release improvements and focusing on that area. A couple of reasons for that. One, releases are often not one person's focus. At any given time, someone on the team is paying attention to a release or another release, and that kind of shifts around when it comes to release process as a whole. It's rarely owned by a consistent sort of team that's giving it the love and attention it needs. I remember at Rent the Runway, where Isabel and I worked together, you would kind of randomly have an engineering manager who would decide to look into the release process, to do something with it. You'd end up with a new elaborate checklist and a spreadsheet. Maybe some of you are familiar with that phenomenon. The team would kind of use it. It would get stale. It would get out of date. And then some months later, new PM comes in they take a look at releases. They want to set up a new run book in, at the time, I think it was Coda, which is something, I don't know if teams still use it. But yeah, it's sort of this shifting responsibility and shifting focus. And when no one person is looking at releases and the macro effects for any amount of time, it means that it never gets the attention it needs, and no one notices when there's actually systemic problems with the process. The other reason it's hard to sort of understand the impact is that this kind of stuff is hard to measure. Things like build time, CI/CD, super easy to go in, find some stats, and act on that. It's much harder to capture and sort of monitor release process performance over time. And so that's really tricky to make visible when there are issues. So looking at some of the actual impact, if you are able to zoom out and get the sort of holistic, the macro view of your team's release process and spend some time watching it over time, you'll actually find that there's some real impact in a number of areas caused by inefficient, subpar, suboptimal release process for mobile. Call it a mobile tax. One is the time spent on release work. There's a sort of steady drip of tasks, context switching, overhead. All of that is resources, time, and focus not spent on your product and not spent on core work. This applies even to platform teams. If you are a larger team, you have a platform team. Oftentimes they're having to do a lot of stuff around release and release tooling. They also have higher order work they could be doing than sort of coordinating and managing releases. So there's a big opportunity cost there for that steady drip of time and effort on releases. And again, if you zoom out, you'll notice that adds up over time. There's an extra penalty there that we like to call out. I think oftentimes you see on orgs the folks who are more involved in releases and make sure they're going on track and solve issues when they come up. Those tend to be more senior folks on the team or subject matter experts. And so, of course, when it comes to resources and time and focus, that's a sort of extra cost if those sorts of folks are being distracted by releases. Another big impact has to do with the fact that releases simply aren't fun. It's not what most people signed up for. I know there are exceptions. I know sometimes you have dedicated mobile release managers. That's great if your team has one, a huge luxury. But for most engineers who get pulled into this role, that's not most of what they signed up for. They want to build product, or they want to work on platform stuff like frameworks and reusable components, whatever it might be. And so certainly when folks are having to switch tasks and switch focus to stuff that's outside their usual domain, that's not so fun, and it takes a toll over time. Yeah, we have personal experience with this. I'm sure Isabel would agree. When we are on a team working on product, and maybe you have a release rotation, you get pulled out, and it's a whole complicated process. You are not the happiest engineer in the world. You'd rather go back to kind of building features and focusing there. We've heard extreme examples of this, just to call it out too, from some teams where the folks that were constantly getting looped in for release management simply couldn't take vacation when they wanted to, because there's big releases they need to get out the door, and they just don't have the distributed knowledge or the ability across the team to deal with and wrangle their release process. So there's real risk with bottlenecks and certainly burnout and DevX issues there. Last point here, zooming out further from the individual impact to the team impact to the business. Subpar release process can create risk to the business in a few ways, and that impact really adds up. One has to do with shipping value to users. You want to get them new features, you want to get them bug fixes when there are issues. An inefficient or suboptimal release process just means that's happening slower, and that can have a huge impact on the business and what business goals are. There's also risk associated with mistakes and bugs, right? So in the process itself, if you have a kind of gnarly release process, it's much more likely that bugs get shipped. If you don't have good sort of QA coverage, test coverage, if you don't have good process around maybe dog fooding or beta builds, whatever stages of sort of quality checks, and also through rollouts, monitoring health, more issues are going to end up in the hands of users. And then on top of that, with a not great release process, you're also going to be slower to be able to resolve issues when that does happen. And no team is perfect. It does happen. So you want to be really good at recovering quickly when it does happen. The result, of course, unhappy users impact your revenue, depending what sort of line of business your company is in. Even a small amount of time with a buggy or bad app out in the wild can very quickly add up to real costs, literal costs to the business. Cool. To put some numbers to this, because again, it can be pretty abstract. We felt that ourselves, and we spent some time with data that we have on our side, working with a bunch of different teams to try to quantify like what you stand to gain, or the inverse, I guess, of the cost if you're actually not focusing on or prioritizing improving your release process. There's a few different metrics here. You probably recognize some DevOpsy metrics, some of the kinds of metrics that can actually be hard to measure for mobile too. But looking at one of the first points we talked about before, just the time and resources your team's spending on releases, we have found if you focus in, improve your process, that can actually be reduced quite dramatically in the context, especially of teams at some scale. That 25% of time back from release time can be put to use elsewhere in an impactful way. Time to recover, we talked about getting fixes out to users more quickly. Product lead time, when you are first sort of thinking about a feature or a change to getting that out to users, speeding up that time is a huge win as well. And then also on the flip side, the sort of late work problem. This is something we probably have all battled with too, is sort of like different teams maybe around the org wanting to get some changes in, or maybe some last minute fixes in. That has this direct correlation with either quality, decrease in quality if you're squeezing in a lot of late work, or it just sort of adds to the stress and workload on a team if you do need to rerun, let's say, a very thorough regression when these changes come in. So being able to safeguard against that and reduce the amount of that late arriving work can be a real win as well. Anything on impact or cost that sticks out to you, Isabel, that we didn't cover?
No, I think you covered it pretty well there. Okay. All right, so we sort of painted a picture of what makes mobile releases so uniquely difficult, what are some of the challenges there, and then Gabe just talked about what that actually means in terms of impact for your team. And if you don't address it, and if you sort of don't take a look at your release process and with an eye towards improving it and set something in place to help your team succeed, like what can happen. So now we're going to talk about what that actually looks like, what it looks like to look at your release process holistically and to manage your mobile releases effectively. And so the first thing that we want to do is just define what we mean by mobile release management. What is that? That's the process that you establish for releasing mobile apps in a safe, reliable, and consistent way. And so these sort of describers of what you should be aiming for, safe, reliable, and consistent. I'm sure there's others that, confidence is a good one that comes to mind, stable. It sort of really depends on what your goals are as a team, but that can be your North Star when you're looking at taking a critical eye at your release process and making improvements where you see opportunities to do that. And so, let's talk about what some of those kind of pillars or elements of your release process are important to consider when you are taking an eye at your release process and trying to make some improvements. And some suggestions, and just from our own experience and from what we've seen with teams as well. So the first one is establishing a realistic release strategy. And so, release trains are really popular, and we're big fans of release trains. And, it really helps kind of bring some consistency into your process and get the team used to following a process kind of regularly and getting use out of it and making sure that it's running on time, and sort of enforce some of those things around like late arriving fixes and making sure that there isn't, too much delay and kind of politicking, which can sometimes happen around folks wanting to get some extra stuff in and whatnot, and really being strict about that. But one thing that we like to talk about when it comes to release trains is being realistic about what your team can do given the guardrails that it has in place. And so one thing that we sometimes see is that teams are like, okay, we want to release more often, so we're just going to establish a release train that's weekly and we're going to stick to it. And without taking a holistic look at all of the guardrails that they either have or don't have, that can actually be pretty disastrous for release process and release management if those guardrails are not in place. And so what guardrails am I talking about? I'm talking about things like unit tests, integration tests, regression tests, like manual regression testing, things like beta testing, putting in place a beta testing program where your release candidate is actually being tested by some percentage or some fraction of your actual users can be great. And then putting in place like some of the metrics that we talked about for actually monitoring your rollouts effectively so you can know what the health of your release is once it's actually out in production. Just taking a peek here. Right. Yeah. So what we sort of recommend when it comes to release trains is definitely taking a pragmatic and realistic approach and being real about what your team can manage and what kind of release train cycle they can establish that's actually safe and isn't going to put unnecessary risk on your app releases. Another one that, of course, we have to talk about, super popular, is the automation of manual tasks. And so we talked a lot about that, steady drip of manual tasks and what a drain that can be on productivity and morale as well, the context switching, some of those negative effects. And so, automate as many manual tasks is absolutely something that we stand behind. A lot of teams already have kind of some of the basics covered, things like building your app, uploading for distribution, that kind of thing. And by the way, if you don't, there's a lot of great tools out there that can help you kind of get to that point where a lot of those fundamentals are in place. Things like Fastlane, highly recommend taking a look and leveraging those third-party tools and open source as well. But besides the basics, we think that there's a lot of opportunities to automate things, manual tasks that are maybe not so obvious. And so we definitely encourage folks to look for opportunities to do that. Just some examples that come to mind that we see from teams are things like adding fixed versions to tickets. So this is something that we talked about at the beginning. It's something like sometimes product does, sometimes engineering does. It's often manual, and it can be just like one of those things that is kind of annoying to do, and you have to do it a bunch. And so that can be a big value gain if you're able to automate that. You can just get that time back, and you don't have to think about it anymore. Another one that comes to mind is cherry picking in late arriving fixes. And for me as an engineer, I always think about, cherry picks, like that's like pretty trivial. You go to your command line, it's a couple of commands, and then you just do that and no big deal. But the thing about manual tasks is that they catch up to you, and there is a real tax that's paid with the context switching that happens when you have to do a little thing like that, and especially for engineers. And so something that might seem pretty trivial and small can actually have an outsized impact on the productivity of your team. Another thing that we like to mention when it comes to automation is that automation and CI/CD in particular is not the same thing as mobile release management. Automation is a tool that you have in your toolbox to improve your mobile release management strategy. It's part of it, but it's not 100% of it. And so I think, most teams that have CI/CD and have some sort of automation kind of quickly realize is that that's not all there is. There's actually just all this other stuff that you also have to do, and you have to have a plan for connecting all of those pieces together so that the automation is part of your strategy, but it is not the entirety of it. And one other thing we like to flag with automation as well is being mindful of the black box effect. So sometimes something that we see, and like I've personally experienced definitely on a couple teams, is there's an engineer like 5 years ago or whatever that got super excited about automating a particular part of the process. They wrote a little script to do that, and that worked well for a little while. But now we're running a critical hotfix, and the script is broken, and that engineer is no longer on the team. And now somebody has to go in there and like read the script they wrote in Bash or like some other scripting language that like nobody actually knows how to use properly. And it's super stressful having that experience of not knowing how something works and really not feeling like you're prepared to fix an automation that nobody really understands how it works. And so kind of being careful of that. And for that, it's really just like, just keep track of the automation that you're using, keep track of where it all lives. If wherever possible, like we would probably recommend like trying to use third-party tools or open source automation. So again, like things like Fastlane are great because they do tend to be like slightly more reliable because there is this like community that's supporting it and making sure that it's sound and whatnot. So that's the automation of manual tasks. One other thing that you can think about when you're looking at evaluating your release management process is fostering better visibility around releases. So this goes back to collaboration and that sort of cross-disciplinary nature of mobile app releases and how important it is to be able to effectively communicate with all the stakeholders that are at play. And so a few recommendations that we have for that are simple things like release calendars can be big wins. And so that could be like a Google Calendar that you keep up to date with key target dates for every release, things like kickoffs, submissions, releases, rollout dates, that kind of thing. And that can be a source of truth for folks to come in just that want to know like what the status or what the timing of a particular release is. Expanding on that, something like a living document for each release where the status of various parts are tracked can be super helpful. Again, trying to create a place where stakeholders feel comfortable coming in and understanding what the status of the things that they care about and what they're involved in is at any given point in time. And that can just help avoid a lot of the sort of just redundant communication and just like over communication on Slack or wherever it can happen. That can happen if you don't have that single source of truth. Release specific channels are another great tool that we see some of our teams leveraging as well, just to try to, again, kind of compartmentalize the communication that is required in the collaborative nature of releases into a single channel every time that you're doing a release. And the last one to raise here is daily status updates. Just short ones can also be really effective at getting on the same page with your team on where things are at for the release. These are sometimes called go, no go, and these can be like super short, like 5-10 minutes, and just kind of clear some of those blockers and get on the same page with everybody involved and stakeholders. And the last point here is just reminding folks to try to create, the goal should be to try to create a process that's repeatable, that's transparent, and one that's ideally possible for anybody on the team to do. Checklists can be really powerful for this, but only if you practice good checklist hygiene. And what that means is really just being super mindful of keeping things up to date and making steps kind of clear and concise. I personally have experienced, checklists like hell, for lack of a better word, where, there's just like, there's too many things in that checklist, definitely things that should be automated, but there's also things that could be kind of better explained or maybe simplified as well. So that's super important. And we like to say that, one side of a great release process is when anybody could do it without dreading it. And so, when you have a release process that people aren't like, oh, it's my turn to run releases, that's when you know that you're doing something right. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Gabe to briefly talk about Runway.
Cool. Thank you, Isabel. Yeah, that North Star is a cool one. We've seen teams focus on that. So the ability for everyone on the team, outside even of engineering. So like there's a fintech we work with that has like business folks and ops and other folks take turns running releases. That's sort of a maybe dream scenario for some teams or a nightmare for others, but it's a good North Star in certain cases. So this kind of discussion, of course, all brings us to Runway, the mobile release management platform that our team is building, but we're not here to tell you all about Runway, say how great it is. I think what we wanted to share is sort of some aspects of the platform, how we're building it, how we're thinking about it, that we think are universally important and relevant if you're looking to tackle mobile release management. So again, some of the themes and ideas that Isabel started talking about just then, areas where you can focus on or look to improve in this context, in sort of like tooling and frameworks, that kind of thing. So first and foremost, one of the biggest themes for us, what we're trying to build here with Runway is creating a unified dashboard, a home, and a single source of truth for mobile releases. A lot of the friction and pain points that we were talking about before come out of the fragmentation of tools and the fact that so many folks across the org are involved. And so if you can create a home, a centralized space for that stuff, there can be a huge amount to gain and a lot of sort of grease in the wheels, let's say, for your release process. So the idea, first and foremost, bring everything into one place, all your people, all your tools, replace the scattered checklists, the docs, and the context switching you need to do across a bunch of tools to understand the overall, status and state of releases. The other idea of having a place like this for folks on your team is to save a lot of or avoid a lot of the question asking and answering that happens. The same sorts of questions, the status of work, where is this at? Why didn't this ship? When did this item of work ship? Is our app, healthy? A lot of the same questions that get asked in Slack or teams of the same few people, and they need to keep digging for answers. Try to make that more self-serve and sort of dynamic. So, static docs, static checklists are not enough. We see teams try to replicate this with sort of big spreadsheets that get filled in, hopefully, if folks remember, with information about a release, that kind of thing. But really trying to create a complete and accurate picture of what all is going on and bring it into one place. So that's a big theme there. And then a third aspect of that is sort of the standardization. So create a framework for actually running releases, not just about collecting info, finding answers. But again, to the points that Bill was talking about, if you can make the process more predictable, more consistent, you're going to see better results. There's less room for things to go off the rails. And if things do start going in a bad direction, there's clear rules, clear guidelines for what any given person on the team who's kind of running things, what they need to do to straighten things out. So this sort of single source of truth and standardization and creation of a framework just keeps everything running more smoothly, gives you a foundation to look at improving your process. We work with a lot of teams that want to speed up their release cadence. If you don't have the rails for that to sort of accelerate on, it's going to be really hard to get there. Another aspect of what we're trying to build and what we would kind of recommend more generally is thinking about integrating across your stack, across your existing tools. There was actually a question sort of related to this in the chat earlier. You will always have specialized tools for different parts of the process. You obviously have your CI/CD, you have project management tools, source control, you have the app stores. There's a reason these specialized tools and point solutions exist. They also are being used by different people on your team. So remembering that, your PMs are going to spend most of their day-to-day in Jira or project management, for example. Despite that, integrate with everything so you can create this unified picture, not leave any people out, and also make sure even when people are sort of off in their own world, like your PMs in Jira, make sure they're seeing an accurate picture of what all is happening with your releases. So the fixed version question is a great example, right? If you can get better at making sure fixed versions or labels are applied to all your tickets, make sure there are no gaps. That's one of the biggest time wasters is like, oh, if you're pretty good at labeling your tickets, but one piece of work that shipped didn't get labeled properly, and someone later on needs to go looking for that, they're going to go on a really difficult, down a rabbit hole to figure things out. So you want the consistency and the confidence that you're actually giving folks on the other side an accurate picture. And you do that by connecting across these specialized tools you're using. So integrations are great. We focus a ton on them. And they help you make sure your team is sort of playing nicely together, so to speak. And then finally, a third theme here, some people's favorite, of course. Another question or I guess a statement about that in the chat, automation. At Runway, we very much talk about or caution, I guess, about the idea of sort of like automation as the complete solution. But at the same time, it has a huge role to play. And what we have found is even very mature teams we talk to have plenty of manual tasks still in their process that they just haven't automated. There are certain automations that are much harder to build and also to maintain in-house. Setting aside just like dealing with integrations, APIs changing, like that's a whole effort. But there's complexity when it comes to a lot of the gaps that exist in teams' existing automation. very often has to do with tasks that are sort of time-based. Maybe they're recurring. It's rare for like mobile teams or platform teams on the mobile side to spin up like servers to be running little tasks. So like recurring tasks, time-based tasks, and then certainly a lot of things that depend on multiple inputs. So across your different tools, back to the fixed version example, to know how to trigger and automate applying fixed versions to tickets or labels, you need to look at other state. You need to look at the code side and the repo and what code has been merged and shipped. And so there's there is an opportunity in these gaps and spaces between tools, spaces in parts of the process where there's like a handoff. Maybe you have like a build running in CI/CD, but when that's done, you need to take some action on it. You need to do something with it into the stores. You might need to distribute it to certain folks on the team. You might need to let teams know about it. All sorts of other stuff that can be triggered there, sort of closing that gap so there's not this opportunity to have extra manual work there or forget to do certain things that need to happen. So yeah, this sort of higher order, more complex automation is super key, and thinking about how the pieces fit together, where there are gaps and how you can sort of cover them is huge. And with that, we've reached the end of our presentation. I don't know if it's cut off there for everyone, but in case it is, that text on the left says questions. And so here's your moment to ask us any questions in the chat. Some folks did already. We can address some of what's in there already. And yeah, Isabel, if you had any closing thoughts, we can also wrap it up here.
Yeah, no closing thoughts. So it's just gonna try to get to some of the questions here in the chat. There's one from John. Any suggestions to handle rollouts and monitoring? I mean, yeah, there's a couple things that kind of come to mind off the bat. It's like, one, we're big believers in phase releases, stage rollouts on Android. If your app is one that can be released in stages, not everybody has an app where you can do that. We highly recommend that. We do have an automation runway to support kind of multi-day rollouts on the Android side, which doesn't come out of the box like it does on iOS. And there's a kind of more opportunity for automation there as well that's actually tied to monitoring. And so on the monitoring side, it's super important to define your health metrics. And this is something that we don't always see teams kind of thinking about, that it's like actually super important when you're talking about the health of a release. Is you don't know if your release is healthy unless you know what health means for your team. And so definitely kind of having a good idea of what does health look like for your team in terms of crash-free users, crash-free sessions, in terms of product analytics, in terms of things like app hangs, startup times, things like that. And then kind of making sure that once you have that, there's a lot of opportunity for kind of layering on additional automation on there as well. And so some of the things that we have built in Runway are things like automatically halting unstable phased rollouts. And so if you define your health metrics and you hook that up to the Play Console or App Store Connect, then you have the ability to actually quickly react to any deviation from your expectation of health. And then that can actually be super valuable for helping your team like react super quickly and avoid it kind of getting rolled out to more folks. Did you want to speak to any more? Yeah. Do you want to add anything to that, Gabe?
Yeah, I think the other interesting aspect related to some of the big themes we've talked about with rollouts is like the current state monitoring can be difficult because you have the kinds of things you want to watch. Again, live in different parts of the org, especially on the product side of things. The folks that are watching conversion rates, for example, and stuff like that, they tend to be sitting more in product, and they tend to be looking at that stuff on a different time scale. They're not necessarily going to be watching it release to release to know if something bad shipped that affected a metric. Very often those folks are looking more like on a week to week or quarterly basis on a different time scale. And they sit in a different part of the org. So it's hard to connect the dots and get that feedback from, let's say, product, the folks who are comfortable and familiar with your product analytics tools, get that back to engineering to actually get the feedback loop and include that in the rollout monitoring. And so again, we see the difficulty with the sort of cross-org topic and the human topic, where you need to bridge that gap or give more self-serve control, maybe to engineering to monitor this stuff, or to pull in those signals, that sort of thing. Yeah, some other questions here. Question about, I'm going to go bottom to top because that just caught my attention. Jira and GitHub, yeah, Runway can integrate with Jira and GitHub, a bunch of other project management tools, and a bunch of other source control tools as well. Handle releases from one single repo to multiple apps, white label. Yeah, so this is a very popular topic and very top of mind for us. So first of all, totally outside of Runway, we've had a lot of conversations with teams like this and know that it's one of the more painful use cases when it comes to releases. I guess, like, on paper, it's just obvious, right? You have all these different destinations you need to ship to. And so at least that slice of the process where you're needing to deal with builds and getting them set up in the stores and managing metadata and releasing and monitoring, that is multiplied, of course, across a whole bunch of apps. So we understand the pain there. We're working on something for that. We have some teams actually that do ship white label apps in Runway. There's some nice shortcuts, automations, ways to reuse integrations across apps that help there, as well as API webhooks. So there's stuff you can do to kind of orchestrate on top of it. But one of our team's biggest projects right now is something that's going to speak directly to the white label use case, and a number of others, which will basically allow you to integrate your release flow across as many apps as you want, have a single sort of work stream, let's call it. And then you will be able to take actions across all of your apps at once. So if you want to, select builds, submit them at the same time, that's a single click instead of going to all the different places. Or you can automate all of that across your different apps. So yeah, without going into too much more detail, big project we're working on right now that should make white label a whole lot easier. And then the one more question there about setting up managing a release rotation. Yeah, this one is interesting. It's a mix of process. So just like the mechanics of it, there's scheduling, there's reminders for folks. The worst thing I think for all parties involved is when someone gets caught off guard. It's suddenly their turn to run a release and they're scrambling. No one knows what's going on, blah, blah, blah. So it's sort of reminders, calendars, expectation setting. But the other huge piece of it is around your release runbook, your process, making sure that is solid and repeatable and there's no room for error. Because often, depending on your team size, you need to remember folks they're not taking their turn as a release manager all the time. That's kind of the point, right? So if there's a gap in when I last ran a release and the next one I run, I'm going to forget stuff. I'm definitely likely to make mistakes. I will feel less well equipped and more stressed in that situation too. And so that's where the guardrails and the process and the standardization come in, is to give your rotation the support they need to run consistent, healthy, successful releases. But aside from that, if you can put the framework in place, the expectation setting, the visibility, a lot of teams run rotations really successfully. And it's a nice way to distribute the load and also avoid something we touched on briefly before, which is the sort of bottlenecks and the bus factor, where you have just one or two sort of subject matter experts who are the ones able to confidently run releases and no one else. Cool. Anything to add on rotations? It's a big topic. I don't know if there's something there, Isabel, you want to touch on?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. Just one question here in the bottom, the limits on the number of apps. No, technically there are no limits on the number of apps you can add to Runway.
Cool. Thank you all for the questions. We'll give it another 20 seconds here for folks to drop in any last questions. Otherwise, we'll thank you once again for joining us. Like I said, recording will go out. Feel free to share with your team. You also have our email addresses there. Feel free to reach out. We love talking about this stuff. So if you want to chat more or have questions or anything like that, definitely get in touch. And yeah, I think that was about 20 seconds. No more questions. So we'll let you all go. Thanks once again, and have a good rest of your days.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.